Welcome to the Perspective Knoll, a home to original fantasy stories. Videos are uploaded once a week, feel free to like and subscribe. Enjoy the journey. Chapter 5 Valinor and the Wood Elves. For a moment, Charles was free falling and he thought this was how he was going to die. A miniature-size human, trapped in a world that no one else knows about, and surely at the bottom of this hole was a mountain of bones from others who were tricked by the Wood Elves, but then the unexpected happened. Not more than a few seconds into the drop, Charles landed on a steep, smooth grade that felt like a layer of mud on a slide. He was now twisting and turning and flipping along this slide at a very high rate of speed. There was a sensation of the air cooling around him and there seemed to be light emitting from somewhere down the tunnel. Onward he slid through the dark and could feel the slide leveling out and his speed was lessening. Without warning, the view before him turned into a wood setting with a large river traveling away from him. For a moment, he hung in the air and he could see more of the elves' houses embedded into the scenery of the tall grass and trees nearby. Then he fell with a splash into the water below. "Over here," cried Shawn from the shoreline to Charles' right. Choking up water and fighting the current, he was able to make it to shore by way of a thick rope that was hanging over the water that stretched from one shore to the other, and hung low enough for someone to reach up and grab it. Once he pulled himself to the shore, he was greeted by Shawn, Greg and a few other elves who were wearing the typical garden gnome attire. "You have to admit that was one hell of a ride," Shawn said as he was wrapped in a towel, and before Charles could respawn there was an elf holding out a towel for him to take. "Ride? I'm not sure that's the word I'd use." At that moment Charles reached for his cell phone, and not only could they not get a call out if they wanted to, but now that their phones were saturated, they won't be able to take any more pictures or videos at all. There would be no proof that this place existed. "Yeah, our phones are toast, but hey, even with the photo proof of this place, most would shrug it off as photoshopped anyways." Shawn too was waving his phone around trying to get whatever water out of it he could, but in the end they both knew it was to no avail. "Hey, come here," called Greg, now heading inland with the other elves. Shawn and Charles had yet to be introduced to the three other elves, but they seemed any bit just like Greg, happy and spoke with almost an Irish accent. Once in the tall grass that towered over them by seemingly 20 feet, gently swaying in a calm midday breeze, they came across another stony path. It followed the river for almost a quarter of a mile, then turned up to a large bridge. They went under it instead of going over it, and there they had come across large stones bigger than a hotel, all stacked upon each other. Greg led them to an opening in the rocks, and within it was like a cave that opened to the world of the Wood Elves. Charles and Shawn looked at each other as they looked upon this hidden town. It looked like a children's make-believe storybook community, perfect little houses with all the loveliness and comfort of a Gemum's house. The largest lay huddled in the center of similar-looking houses, yet they were not as big nor as grand. The little houses and surroundings areas were lit with tiny candles that gave off an extraordinary cosmic effect, not amber like one would think, but a deep purple color, and small beads of white light swirled around. It still was dark and smelt of soil and water in the massive cave. Charles says to himself, "Okay, it's time to go to work. Ask questions, put all the others on the spot to make sense of this. Let's start at the beginning with the oil painting, the cabin, and Harmon." Shawn on the other hand was taking it all in and felt as if he had entered a wonderful dream. "Murder or no murder, I'm so glad we came here. Wow, what a place." Charles turned to Greg. "I would like to ask you a few questions." Before Greg could answer there was a loud whizzing sound and then an explosion like a firework over the center house. It burst of amber light, and there on the step of the house was a plump elf, and he was bent over a walking stick. The other elves who began gathering about at the sight of their new visitors had all stopped and held their breath at the sight of this elder. "Come forward." The voice boomed throughout the chamber, and Shawn and Charles knew that he couldn't have been talking to anyone else. They did as instructed and walked up towards the house. It made the pair feel a little better about the situation when they realized that Greg was following behind them. As they approached, they now noticed there were two elves standing on either side of the house where they were walking towards, and each of them wielding what appeared to be slingshots. They looked serious and wore clothes that were funny like the other elves, but they noticed it was much thicker, perhaps made from leather instead of cloth or wool. The old elf still on the step of the house was standing there, eyeing them and studying them hard as they drew nearer. He was much older and his white beard was so long that it almost touched the ground. "As I suspected, humans," said the older elf. "Why did you bring them here?" He gave Greg a stern look. It was sure Tar Happen, Elder Valinar, this we knew was going. Tar Happen, said Greg as he stepped closer to his chief elf. There's been too much travelers roaming round air recently. No good ever come from it, never. There's been a killing in their world. Valinar turned his gaze back to Charles and Shawn and then looked down at the ground before his feet as if disappointed. Yes, we knew of such things to come about, but he sighed greatly and stared at his new visitors. Too often has it been happening now. Are you saying more murders have been committed in my world through yours? Asked Charles. It is not clear, but enough whispers have been traveling about Lufforain that suggest otherwise. Valinar stepped off his step and got within a foot of Charles. He seemed to be examining him in a very odd fashion. You must be an intelligent man, you have a certain aura about you, and we have another man here, also from your world, who is dark-skinned and very educated. Well, I'm flattered. I am a detective, said Charles awkwardly. Valinar then walked over to Shawn and examined him in the same way. Are you from the war too then? War? Shawn is taken aback. Yes, the World War, You know the big war from your world. No, I was not in any of the world wars. Wait, you know about our history. Shawn was very intrigued now. You are not the first humans to come to our village, as I have stated just moments ago. We have 3 here with us before you 2 came along. Valinar shifted his gaze, and walking up behind them was an awe-striking sight. A single man walked towards them, and he was also dark-skinned and yet wore clothes like the elves. Gentlemen, welcome to another dimension. I'm Neil deGrasse Tyson, perhaps you've heard of me? Shawn's face dropped and was shocked beyond belief. Neil had his own podcast called Star Talk Radio, and Shawn listened to it regularly. Neil is an astrophysicist who has appeared in many shows regarding the cosmos, including Cosmos: A Space Odyssey itself. Charles, on the other hand, merely shrugged. How did you get here? Asked Shawn excitedly, and was now about to shake his hands. Wait, are you allowed to do that in our world yet? Neil asked, and was referring to Shawn's outstretched hand. Well, sort of. COVID is still pretty strong at work in our society, Shawn answered, now withdrawing his hand into his pocket. So, wait a minute, did he tell you that you were intelligent based on your skin color? Neil was now looking at Charles. Yeah, what did he mean by that? Charles asked, as if it just now struck him that it was odd for Valinar to say such a thing. Neil gave a very audible laugh. Ever since he's met me, he thinks that dark-skinned people are smarter than light-skinned people that come from our world. That is, if they have come through the portraits. There is another couple here, they are white but from a different time, much further in the past. But their knowledge of the world was not broad at all due to lack of the internet in their time. Look, we'll talk more in depth later, and your questions can wait. Indeed, you both need to follow me now, said Valinar as he walked past them and had them follow him away from the town. Neil did not follow them because Valinar did not invite him to do so, but Charles and Shawn followed behind the elder closely with his 4 armed elves at his back. It was a quiet walk with the rhythm of Valinar's beating walking stick pounding the soil to keep everyone in step. The chamber began to narrow and curve to the right. The light still followed the walls and illuminated the cave beautifully. Shawn wondered how they got the candles to burn purple, or if it was the tint of the glass that encaged the flame. He never got close enough to examine it well enough for an answer, but either way, he found that aspect most enchanting. Charles, on the other hand, was puzzled about other humans being in this realm. He knew of Neil's accomplishments but wasn't a fan of his. Yet he knew the man well enough that he lived on the East Coast. Furthermore, the chances of him being connected to the Spencers at all raised a red flag for him. Neil was now a suspect, and the one he was most interested in questioning how and when he got here and why he is still here. To Charles, it seems like Neil is here to hide from his crimes, and what better place to do it. They came to a T in the cavern, and instead of going left or right, Valinar walked straight ahead. He paused just before he hit the wall and gave his walking stick 3 taps in what may have been a triangle pattern on the wall itself. The next moment the wall groaned and an archway appeared before them, sunken in, and the outline of a large door now stood before them. Once again, Valinar placed his walking stick on the door, and this time he made a circle and then put a line through it. The next moment the door swung slowly inward and Valinar turned his head just enough to see Charles and Shawn's expressions, and then onward he pressed. There were steps that curved downward like a spiral staircase. The air seemed even thicker down here, and the sound of water began to reverberate all around them. They came upon another large chamber, and yet there were no longer any lights to guide them. However, Valinor remedied that, with one of the elves' great magic tricks that Shawn and Charles had seen Greg use this exact thing before. There was a small pop. And soon there was a cloud of golden mist that twinkled and illuminated the area about them. The smoke traveled slowly throughout the chamber, and that's when they realized that they were in a library of sorts. "Come," said Valinor as he walked towards a large wall with carvings upon it. Shawn and Charles stopped just behind Valinor and looked at the artwork in awe. Illustrations of structures that stood like towering castles, creatures that appeared straight from a horror movie, and some as if they belonged to the world of the Wizard of Oz. "Is this a map of your world?" Shawn asked. "Well, not a map per se, but more of an accurate drawing of who and what rules over certain areas in Lufforain," said Valinor as he stood now in between Charles and Shawn. "This has been a recreated masterpiece which has served as a guide for many elven generations. Most of which I have no desire to see with my own eyes. The world I know is dangerous beyond measure. I'm perfectly fine with staying within my own borders till the day Hasnath takes my spirit. Why would you show us this? We are outsiders. Don't you think something like this should be kept away from people like us?" asked Charles, who for a second was able to tear his eyes away from the artwork. "Yes," Valinor answered with a hint of sorrow. He moved back a little more and there was a wooden table with 4 chairs around it and a few loose pieces of paper upon it. Valinor took a seat and gestured for Shawn and Charles to do the same. To put it simply, the beings in this world are almost impossible to trust outside of their own races. I'm a wood elf and I enjoy the peace of the Brunil forest. I wish not to go anywhere else. The trolls of the Hiatus Mountains are proof that the other races are here to conquer. Living in peace is a dying notion. We were told about that battle. You trusted Ed Spencer and his friend Harmon to aid you. The fairy Argatha as well, and I'm sure there were others that helped. You must have some faith in the other races?" asked Charles, feeling that Valinor, being the elder, would be the best person to start looking for answers. "Faith? I have faith in the Creator, human. I have faith in what my fellow elves can do. I cannot trust the words of anyone I do not know nor trust because of what conflicts have transpired in the past." Valinor chuckled a bit. "The trolls are the best example of that. Then there was a great feast in the Western Kingdom to celebrate our coming to terms of their surrender. Having a meal with an enemy is not a delicious one, no matter how it is served. Ever since that day we, meaning only my kinfolk, all agreed to cut our ties with any kingdoms and live as our own. First off, just like you, we too have names." Charles was seeming annoyed now. "So enough with the human crap. My name is Charles and this is my friend Shawn. Can we exclude the word human out of this conversation unless you're referring to an entire race?" "I meant no offense," Valinor said with an apologetic tone. "So why trust us? I mean, you are sharing a part of your culture with us or pieces of your world, why?" Shawn asked, and with his words began to study the papers on the table. "In this world, I know the races and why they exist, and just like the ancient elves of Gorferndain, they wish to rule all. Everyone wants a slice of their own heaven and most have it. However, everyone wants more. Greed is the biggest enemy in my realm." Valinor paused and sighed, and then a smile came across his face. "Humans, from your world as I have come to find out, are not at all like the races here. Most, like Neil and the married couple you have yet to meet, all they want is peace and a way to uplift themselves and those around them." "So not every race here wants peace?" Charles asked. "Yes and no. They want peace, but only after there is one true ruler of Lufforain," answered Valinor, and his head turned back to the art on the wall. "The Western Kingdom here is run by 2 little mice you see there on the left. King Uriel and Queen Memphia. What are those towering figures behind them?" Charles asked while trying not to laugh at the fact that he had just heard Valinor say that the king and queen of the Western Kingdom were mice. "Those are the 2 forms in which they keep concealed. King Uriel is in fact the very last of his kind, known as a tree newt. An entity made of the forest countless ages ago by the goddess of nature herself, Vallimna. He in short is a tree with bark that cannot be shattered and abilities to command the forest itself to aid him. Queen Memphia is more of a sprite. She is human and elf-born, but that is not what makes her a sprite. Sprites can only be born in the month of Ornana, which only comes around once every 10 years. A sprite possesses a wicked amount of power that also pulls from the forest and life itself. Her mind alone will rip you in pieces. She needs no artifact of power. Memphia is power. Odd, don't you think? Why would they not help you in your battle with the trolls, or did they?" Shawn asked now with a fearful chill coming over him. No, they did not. Not a single soldier was dispatched from that kingdom. They felt the battles of others needed to be kept amongst themselves and let the better one win. They have no purpose to go to war unless their very castle is being attacked, and I pity the fool who dares try. As we move along, the southern kingdom which has a name, Shaladin. I should have pointed out that the western kingdom is its name and the only one that doesn't have a less obvious name for what it is. Shaladin is not even on land. Valinar continued, and he seemed eager to get through the history lesson before any more questions came from it. It is underwater and is patrolled by mer people. The king, Argatha, had lost his queen long ago. Her name has been lost to the ages. She had fallen in love with a being from the upper world. That's where we are. Anyways, King Argatha allowed her to live her life up here. He even changed her body to where she appeared more human than anything. The water, though it looks cool and refreshing, the merfolk might just kill you for trespassing. The king had become very bitter towards anything that was above the water. The eastern kingdom of Valkernesis is run by 2 humans. That doesn't look like humans, Shawn interrupted. They look like werewolves, said Valinar sharply with a slight impatient tone. I am told in your world that werewolves only come out at the sight of the full moon. That's a tale to keep children in line, but that is far from the truth. Their strength is tenfold when in the creature form and 3 times the size of their former selves. They do not have king and queen titles to their names, and none dare to enter that part of the country these days. Simply they are Rowena, the woman who lost her human form by the first werewolf. He became her husband, and to this day Donnell is still the first werewolf of Lufforain and is considered one of the new gods. Lastly, to the northern kingdom, the elves of Gorferndain, and so is their kingdom named. It is ruled by 2 brothers. Insenol, being the oldest, is technically the one who holds the throne or high power in Gorferndain. Then there is Insamal, the youngest and a very skilled warrior who leads their armies. They have magic that would make Queen Memphia hesitate to challenge on the count that the Gorferndain elves are believed to be the oldest race in the world, and their magic is very powerful. It is said that they are the reason for the paintings to exist in the first place. Like the painting we used to get here? Charles asked, now very intrigued. Why would they need to create a way to get into another world? Greed, answered Valinar, standing up, and as he looked down on the table, he reached for a sheet of paper. He studied it for a moment and tossed it in front of Charles. This is news from our Queen Memphia just a week ago. It's begun. Charles looked at the paper, and it was news from Queen Memphia herself. She had signed it at the bottom. It read, to Elder Valinar and the wood elves of our forest, Brunil. Word has reached us that to the north, a small village containing humans was attacked in the daylight. The men were farming and gathering food and supplies. The women and children had stayed in and around their homes. When the men returned, the village was cleansed of all living things. The men retreated to our keep where we have been taking care of them, but their grief is turning into rage and the thought of retaliation burns within most of them. I fear that the brothers may be to blame. The men of the village had told of banners being placed around their homes, being the symbol of Gorferndain. Please keep a watch over your lands and be prepared. I fear that this may be the start of the battle for Lufforain. Your Queen, Memphia. Also, the paintings are being tracked, the ones accounted for, and yet others still have yet to be found. I hope Ed and Chloe are still well. Charles put the paper down and slid it over to Shawn so that he too could have a look at it. Charles looked over at the wall again and studied what he believed were foes of all kinds. He then looked around the chamber and the bookcases that lined the walls and wondered what sort of information lay hidden in them. There was a new world here, things to learn from scratch, and yet the mountain that it was. How could he solve a murder in a place that might not share the views the earth did as far as crime went? Who made the paintings and how many were made? Charles asked, folding his arms and returning his gaze to Valinar. The paintings were all made by one man, Leo Mandarin, and all at one point had been purchased by a being who worked in the shadows for the Gorferndain brothers. They were beautiful as if you had stared into the heart of Leo himself. That is if you have truly marveled at his work for any period of time, answered Valinar, and he was now sitting back in his chair and picking at the dirt under his fingernails. Yeah, it's something, but how many were made and how is the Queen and King of the Western Kingdom keeping track of them? Valinar eyed Charles oddly as if he wanted to say something but was perhaps debating whether or not to trust Charles and Shawn with the information. Yet a few moments had passed and he then made up his mind. There are 22 paintings that we know of that are gateways into your world. Unfortunately, they are only tracking 8 at the moment because that is all that's been seen. 8 are in the Western Kingdom and the other 14 are unknown. There might be more in this part of the world, but I do not know. Now, as for how they are tracking them, I was not granted such details. Charles paused and knew at some point that he wasn't going to be able to get all the intel out of the elder elf. Thinking of his next words, he glanced at Shawn, who was now reading through the other pieces of paper in front of him. "Do you know where the painting is that Ed and Chloe had traveled through?" "Yes," Valinar answered and looked hard into Charles' eyes. "Have you been through the painting or seen it yourself?" "I have seen it, but no, myself nor any wood elf has gone through the paintings. It is forbidden to travel to other worlds. It is against our nature to do so and therefore hurts the soul, or so it is believed." Valinar leaned forward. "The real question is, how did the murderer get through and back out, undetected?" "What do you mean undetected?" Charles asked. "There are many in the forest here. Not one elf knows of any travelers that have come by road or otherwise for that matter, so the only way to get through is by flying." Valinar paused and seemed to shudder at his words, and he sat slumped back in his chair as if the sudden realization of something had plunged his heart to the very depths of the coldest place on the planet. What is it?" Shawn asked as he looked up and was concerned about Valinar and his reaction. "Owls," Valinar squeaked out. "Sorry, I didn't quite get that," said Charles as he leaned in closer across the table. "It never occurred to me." "Not till this very moment," Valinar rubbed his forehead. "The one thing in this forest that has been our greatest enemy is the Stormbreaker owls. They are a clan of the worst kind." "Owls, huh?" Shawn began and almost smiled as he was trying to hold back a laugh. "You're saying a gang of owls came through the painting and dropped a heavy bowling ball on Ed Spencer? Surely Chloe or Argatha would know of this." "Perhaps not," said Valinar, now striding over to his nearest guard and whispering something in his ear. The guard took off at a great pace and Valinar returned to the table, but he did not sit back down. "These owls are cunning. You were full height before you came here and a 3-foot-tall owl might not seem like a big threat then. Look at yourselves now. A handful of inches tall, you're a nice snack to these giants now. Well, get us to normal size again so we can go hunt these things." Charles was confident. Although he had never hunted any sort of game in his life, he was willing to try. "Not going to happen, Charles," said Valinar quickly. "You need to be far away from our village before we can get you back to normal size. The Stormbreaker owls have yet to find this place we call home, and I am not ready to pack it all up this time, so you can tango with those foul creatures. No, you will stay here for a while." "How long?" asked Shawn, feeling like he was about to be placed in prison. "Until we figure out our next move. Until then, the village is yours to move about freely and mingle with our people, but don't try and sneak off. This powder spell upon you will not go away unless the counter powder spell is absorbed into your lungs. Understood?" "Yes, sir," said Charles. Valinar said nothing more and the guards led them all back through the lower chamber and up the spiral staircase. Once the door was magically sealed behind them and hidden from sight, the guards rushed off to the Gemum's house with Valinar limping quickly behind them. Shawn and Charles were left alone with nothing but the purple cosmic light of a nearby lantern to accompany them. Shawn looked at Charles and gave him a heavy pat on the back. "Well, since we are going to be here a while, let's ask around about these owls." "Owls?" Charles laughed at the absurdity of owls being suspects. Charles and Shawn sat looking at each other and their surrounding environment for several minutes. Finally Charles spoke. "Before we get to the owls, we need to go back over all the events that have occurred since we went through the painting." As they began to discuss every event, it became very clear to Charles that there was much more here. "Let's go for a walk."